Hello and welcome to Unstress. My name's Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Now today's podcast, wait for it, is about the future survival of the earth and humanity. A big topic, I'll give you that. And if ever there was an understatement, that was it. But my guest today is a fifth-generation farmer who has written a fabulous book on regenerative agriculture and has not only asked some very difficult questions, but he's also come up with some solutions that are relevant to you and me in ways you may not even considered. Now, what is regenerative agriculture? Well, in order to understand it, you've got to understand how almost all of our food in the Western world is produced and the effect it's having not just on our health, but the health of the land and more specifically the soil, which, it's worth remembering, is a finite resource. There's a limit. And if you're saying to yourself, well, don't worry about it, you think they'll get it all sorted out. Well, the current trends of epidemic, preventable degenerative diseases, if that's anything to go by, and I repeat, preventable, well, I think we need to all think again. The alternative, or rather the norm in our world, is that we've got a very mechanistic, industrialised approach to agriculture. With its concentration on very technological solutions. And it's been that way, dominating Western society for over 3 centuries, since over this whole scientific era. Now, this way of thinking has led to a practice of industrialised farming, marked by heavy use of machinery, pesticides and artificial fertilisers. Now, the monopoly of this form of farming has led to a very, very sad situation. We've got degraded soils, reduced productivity, financial hardships for farmers, and a very, very high, above average, suicide rate. And while we're at it, for us, the consumer, it's led to what is seemingly cheap food, and I say seemingly because you need to factor in the flow-on costs of medical expenses and environmental degradation. So we're kidding ourselves if we think food is cheap. And to that I would add, as Charles points out in my discussion with him, to an overabundant supply of calorie-high and nutrient-poor food, which in turn has led to this epidemic in preventable chronic degenerative diseases like cancer, heart disease. There are now over 80 autoimmune diseases. Now that is the body attacking itself, not to mention diabetes and obesity. And if all this is connected to what we are talking about today. So this really is a story for us all, particularly for those that have any interest in the survival of the earth and, for that matter, humanity. I hope that includes all of us, and I hope you enjoy my conversation with Charles Massey. Welcome to the show, Charles.
Oh, thanks very much. Great to be here.
Charles, one of the things that's often intrigued me is that Homo sapiens as a species have been around for 200, maybe 300,000 years, and we're always told genetically we haven't changed that much, but something happened 10,000 or so years ago that started the agricultural revolution, but something prompted that or allowed that to happen, which has seen us take over the world. What was it?
Well, that's a point that directly relates to what we're talking about. But the fact that we haven't changed much, of course, isn't true. We're constantly evolving, especially with new forms of genetics like epigenetics and stuff. But Getting back to that, the Homo sapiens, yes, you're quite right, that the modern form probably has been around 250,000 years or so when we really evolved what's called the symbolic brain. But it went, the last sort of 100,000 years up to 10 or 12,000 years ago was pretty rugged time, the Ice Age period, the Pleistocene and all that. And then suddenly, dates vary, but 11 to 12,000 years ago, we moved out of that into this perfect phase of, or a geological era that absolutely suited humanity. It's called the Holocene. So the huge challenges of ice ages disappeared and conditions reigned on Earth, temperature across large areas, rainfall, and post the glacial period you had a lot of rich soils. And the consequence was that, and carbon dioxide in there, of course, and the consequence was that humanity moved into a new phase of culture, which we now know as agriculture. I mean, that took thousands of years to evolve, but it started with domestication of plants and then animals, and dogs were domesticated before that. But and that led to an enormous cultural shift and a change also in our biological evolution and the rise of agriculture. Really, many people say, well, it's led to the modern destruction of Earth because we started to shift from what you could call the organic mind, where we saw ourselves as totally indivisible with Mother Earth, to a situation where we started to see ourselves as being able to dominate, manipulate and extract its resources. So it's you couldn't have started with a better question, really. It's a big shift. Without
that environmental period of stability, we wouldn't really be able to have moved on.
No, that's absolutely right. We would have been grappling for survival on the margins of the Earth where the ice wasn't reaching, and of course the ice ages were very dry, and so the capacity to grow crops and have access to herd animals for our hunting and all the rest of it, survival was just too tough. And so it enabled all that, absolutely right.
Yeah, of course we're gonna move on to how things have changed, but in Australia, of course, I mean, people always change the landscape. I mean, that's happened for every time a human has moved into an area, and the native Australian Aboriginal moved into Australia again anywhere from 65 to 80,000 years ago. And they changed the landscape too, didn't they? I mean, because there was megafauna around then, there were animals over 50 kilos, and the landscape looked quite different. But they changed the landscape, haven't they?
They did, subtly, maybe not quite as profound as some might argue. But, I mean, the irony is that the driest continent on Earth and what's regarded as overall the hottest was settled because of ice. In other words, at the ice ages, the sea levels were very low, and that enabled the crossing of the Aboriginal population from, we now know, at least 65,000 years ago, when Australia then was known as Sunderland. It's 30% bigger because New Guinea, Tasmania and vast reaches of our continental shelf were then dry land. You know, we've got to be careful we don't sort of extrapolate that sort of noble savage concept, because as Indigenous people settled all over Australia, probably within 10, 15,000 years to every corner, they would have made mistakes, etc., and it's remarkable they survived, because running around Australia at the time were these giant megafauna, elephant-sized wombats, diprotodons, giant lizards that make the Komodo dragon look like a little skink, and things like that. There are some fearsome predators, and also Australia's got a range of the most poisonous plants, sea life, etc., that you can encounter. So they survived that trial and error, and what they encountered was a landscape that had been adapted to fire. You know, 65% or so of our vegetation needs fire or molecules in smoke to germinate and propagate, and somewhere along the way they evolved incredible skills at burning to create, for example, fresh food for kangaroo and other macropods. And Bill Gammage writes brilliantly about this in his book, The Greatest Estate on Earth. And even though it's a challenge to some of the biophysical scientists, I think the basis of his thesis is right. That when Captain Cook and company sailed up the east coast, ironically, he thought that Indigenous people were just very primitive and just wandered around vicariously harvesting or hunting. But at the same time, he commented on the smoke. And what he actually saw was a sophisticated land management where fire was used to create and shape resources for food, etc., etc.
Because I've heard you say that you're in the Rural Fire Service, but the Aboriginal skill with fire pales your knowledge into, you know, like they're very skillful with their use of fire.
Extraordinary. And look, I've had the privilege of working with an local Indigenous elder and the Garago man, and we run an annual burning workshop with him. And, yeah, I thought I knew a little bit about fire. I was fire captain for a period when we had a really bad firebug, 60-odd big fires. And in that case, you're fighting hot fires at the worst time of year. But the Indigenous people knew how to use sort of cool burns, whether it was in the top end in the early dry season without conflagrations and a lot of carbon emissions. But I'm just in awe of the skills I'm learning from this guy. And it's something we'd like to implement a bit more in our own management.
Now let's just get on to the subject of industrialised farming. And before we talk about what are the features that kind of challenge our landscape, what proportion, just so our listeners know, we are talking about food that they are eating, what proportion of our food in Australia, or for that matter in the Western world, is produced by industrialised farming?
Look, I can't give you the exact amount, but compared to indigenous cultures and peasant cultures, it'd have to be well into the 90%. And when we're talking about industrial food, we're talking about, in a nutshell, the destruction of food, plants and animals, the destruction in those species of a huge range of nutrients. If I go back a step, plants and animals and humans, we didn't just, if you take a thorn bush, it didn't just pop up with thorns. It co-evolved in that landscape over hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years. And so take the thorn bush, it evolved thorns because animals kept grazing it for its leaves, so its protection device was either thorns or bitter chemicals or something like that. Conversely, those animals, including humans who ate those animals, we were co-evolving at the same time. And so we're hardwired internally for detecting a huge range of nutrients. I'm talking about tens of thousands, both primaries, the basics like amino acids and minerals and stuff. And there's a vast number of secondaries, what I call the phytochemicals, that come through plants from photosynthesis. And some of them are medicational factors, some of them are high nutrition and health preventers and stuff. And so if you put that in the back of the mind and then think about what we've done with the industrial world, we've gone in and destroyed our soils by and large, and that's still accelerating through ploughing and poisoning. So a lot of those nutrients out of a healthy soil come via the microbial, the bacteria and fungus and other bugs, which source the minerals for the plants, and the exchange is they get plant sugars out of photosynthesis. And once you start ploughing and poisoning, et cetera, and beating up the landscape, those nutrients aren't sourced. And so our food plants, for example, are dependent on the modern fertilisers we give them. They become drug addicts, but only for a very limited range of nutrients. And so I think what's behind your question is, has our food changed under the industrial system in the Western world? Well over 90%. Absolutely dramatically. And then the other component of that is not just what we're doing to where it comes from, but it's what we then do in the food processing, and which is destroying most of the rest of the nutrients through the way we over-process and denature it and add in additives and all the rest of it. So, and then, to have it on a retail shelf, it's got to be able to last long periods in packets, and basically it's denatured crap, a lot of it.
It's so interesting because in health, the big breakthrough in health is now said to be the gut microbiome. We're learning so much about whether we're feeding our friends or our foes, and there's 10 times more microbes in our body than human cells, and yet we're also learning about the importance, although it's been known for some time, but we're learning about the importance of the microbiome in the soil.
Absolutely right, and the two go together, of course, and each of them are now ignored and crewed by an industrial capitalist system that destroys both. The modern foods just aren't providing the fibre, and that doesn't just mean sort of rough fibre and material. It means all sorts of materials that gets into that we ingest that aren't immediately absorbable, like easy sugars and proteins and things, and salts, and it means the leftover material, which our large intestine, our gut, really needs to function, and they're only getting about 30% of what they need. And really, if you look at it, the interface between us and our environment and our entire immune system, as you quite rightly point out, is that second part of it, which is the microbiology in our guts, equivalent to a second brain, and that's where the whole immune system's set up. And if you're not looking after that, and more importantly, as we can probably discuss later, the world's most widely used herbicide, glyphosate, otherwise known as Roundup, it's specifically knocking out a key amino acid pathway and therefore destroying much of our immune system. And I think it's incredibly closely linked to a lot of the modern diseases. But maybe we can touch on that later.
Yeah, no, I'd like to, because I think the other thing about the gut microbiome, and I'm assuming this is true of the soil microbiome too, is the issue about resilience, building resilience.
Absolutely right. I mean, let me give you an idea of, I don't have the specific figures at hand, but if you take a teaspoon of healthy soil, that's a soil that gets lots of plant sugars and organic material so that the bugs can feed, and it's a whole zoo. There's about 10 different types of major animal or microbial families in there, but it starts with bacteria, and you can have billions of these, of different varieties, and just a teaspoon of healthy soil. Then the other guys that people aren't aware of are what are called the root funguses, the mycorrhizal fungi. Now, just to give you an example, in a really healthy soil, just think about a cubic metre, like a kitchen table, metre high, metre wide, deep, etc. In a cubic metre of healthy soil, these funguses, they've got this nice exchange partnership with plants. So the plant roots give them sugars. Their part of the deal is to go out and hunt for all these nutrients for the plant. Tens of thousands of different types of nutrients and basic minerals and stuff. And to do that, they have these microscopic tubes called hyphae. Now, in a healthy soil, just one cubic metre, there might be 40 kilometres of these hyphae hunting these nutrients for the plants and therefore for us and or the animals we eat. You go nuking that soil with too much fertiliser or chemical or over-ploughing and beating the hell out of it, the hyphae shut down. There's no fungus there, the soil's compacted and they don't work, and so you're restricted to a very, very narrow range of nutrients. And so our entire pharmacy, natural pharmacy and nutrition centre shuts down.
Yeah, the comparison between the gut microbiome and the soil microbiome, it's fascinating, and it's interesting also because in the human body, we've taken this adversarial approach to the microbiome, everything with antibiotics, first of all, but then everything antibacterial, killing 99% of all, is a great sales pitch, killing all 99% of all bacteria. And of course, the use of herbicides and pesticides and the way that the industrial farming goes on, it's taken an adversarial approach to the soil microbiome.
Absolutely right, and of course driven to the benefit of the great multinationals, whether it's the pharmacological side or the industrial ag side or whatever. But there's a bigger story here which I tell early in the book, and that is that there's been a shift in the human mind which has led to all this. And if you go back to, the indigenous people you spoke about, but also early medieval farmers or something, they had what you could call an organic mind. They still saw themselves as an indivisible part of Mother Nature, Mother Earth, etc., etc. And then through a process, and this is all logical, look, the brilliant process that agriculture led to towns and then cities and civilization and advanced culture. And the remarkable phase of the Renaissance, the scientific revolution, and then the industrial revolution and capitalism, all extraordinary stuff with wonderful knowledge. But at the end of that, particularly with modern economic rationalism and industrial capitalism, we humans now don't see ourselves as an indivisible part of Mother Earth. We see ourselves as separate. And if you think about the white settlers that arrived in Australia, they carried that mind at the very cusp of that when all those revolutions were bedding down. And Earth, and indeed indigenous people, were seen as exploitable resources or inferior beings in the case of indigenous people. But the Earth was seen as just a resource base, a substrate for plunder and profit. And so that's really what's behind. I mean, if we really, truly saw ourselves through an organic mind that we're an indivisible part of Mother Nature, we'd be nurturing our bacterial world, our microscopic world, etc., rather than treating it as an enemy.
Now, we're going to get on to how you have proposed in your wonderful book, which is called The Call of the Reed Warbler, which I'm going to ask you about in a sec. But you're a fifth-generation farmer, and presumably, your family and your farming were part of this thing. In health-wise, people often face a major trauma before they turn around and rethink things. Is that what happens in the farming world as well?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess, cut a long story short, I was always very keen on nature, naturalist. I went to ANU as an undergraduate in the early 70s to do zoology. I wanted to become a wildlife ecologist and behaviourist. But I also did one of the first courses in Australia on holistic thinking, human ecology there. And then at the age of 22, my father had a major heart attack, and so I decided to, being an only child, I'd come home and run the farm. Well, growing up on a farm doesn't equip you to be a good landscape manager. I knew bugger all. So I proceeded to make every mistake in the book. You know, I ploughed soils I shouldn't have and they washed away, or I left my animals on paddocks which destroyed the valuable perennials, all that sort of stuff. It was in the process then when I developed a merino sheep stud using new molecular genetic and other scientific knowledge to evolve a new sort of fibre, and we evolved an animal-friendly sheep that didn't need the cruel practice of mulesing, etc., etc. So I had hundreds of clients across 6 states by the end of that, and many of them were what you'd call the early adopters who picked up new ideas, and I noticed that quite a number were also adopting some of the new thinking in regenerative agriculture, this new ecological agriculture. And I thought it was so important, I went back in my mid-late 50s to do a PhD at ANU, examining why these people had totally transformed from one form of thinking to the other. And I'm getting to the question you asked.
No.
So I interviewed 80 of the top farmers, men and women across Australia, into this new field, and then analysed their language, and because metaphor is a great indicator of what's going on in people's thinking, because we're hardwired, and that was part of that evolution you talk about 250,000 years or so ago. And what I found that in 60% of these leading innovators who developed new types of farming or were adopting it, some sort of major life crisis had cracked open their mind, and you know it might have been one case burned in a bushfire, marriage breakup, major drought of the 80s affected a lot of us, etc., etc., and other people poisoned by chemical. That seemed to crack open the carapace of their mind, and the other 40-odd% wasn't always some shock, but it was often a series of destabilising shocks, or they were already predisposed to that. And I thought that was a really intriguing fact. It just shows you how deeply entrenched what I call this mechanical mind, this post-organic mind really is.
You know, over 10 years ago, I used to think, well, what does farming have to do with me anyway? But then I started to realise, with the help of some very dear friends who are connected, very closely connected with the farming industry, then I started to realise it actually had an awful lot to do with me. And if I wanted my kids, and for that matter my grandkids and their kids as well, we need to leave a legacy and not a mess. And by the way, I also asked Charles about glyphosate, which is the technical term for Roundup. And then he mentioned that at a recent beer festival, 12 of the top beers had glyphosate that is Roundup, in the beers. So it's a very big story, and he had this to say about glyphosate.
If you want to know, I think glyphosate is the coming tobacco issue. It's huge, and it's just starting to unravel a bit. Obviously, the vested interests are sitting on it, but I think it's going to be absolutely enormous, that issue, when it blows up.
Yes, because it's in everything, isn't it? I think I heard you even mention once that it even made its way to a German beer festival.
It did. It's in baby's milk, and the key point, as you picked up very quickly earlier, it targets the key metabolic pathway in our guts, the amino acid pathway for our entire immune system, and that's why it's implicated in most modern diseases. I think it's the most terrifying thing. You know, Rachel Carson, you could invent Silent Spring number 2 all over again now and just build around this chemical alone if you wanted. I think it's a huge story, yeah.
Yeah, and it's ubiquitous. It's everywhere.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yes. Well, I know that you also have an issue with the word sustainability, which leads us to this, you know, what you are championing, and this is this regenerative agriculture. Can you explain why sustainability doesn't really capture it for you?
Well, you know, it's played an important role. In the last 20, 30 years, it was the buzzword in science, etc., sometimes used not necessarily to positive ecological ends, as in sustainable development or something, but so it's played a role. But to me now, it's sort of, it's not quite a weasel word, but it just means marking time, holding firm to me now. It's overused, and whereas the concept of regenerative agriculture means moving forward to a new, healthier state, and the word regeneratus comes out of the Latin roots. You know, there's moral implications with it as well. And I guess one of the big ideas, when I went back to uni after 35 years or something, I'd obviously been preoccupied in doing other things, and I hadn't kept up with a lot of the modern thinking in systems thinking and ecology. And so in the last 20 years, there's been huge developments coming out of computers and in modern systems thinking and some of the extraordinary way out physics, whether it's chaos theory or complexity theory and stuff. And out of that had emerged sort of an understanding across all the disciplines that these giant systems, and not just giant, can be, say, a healthy soil, are what scientists call complex adaptive systems, that they're all hugely interrelated across all the different elements, and they sort of, even Earth is a complex adaptive system. It sort of has all these elements that function together to maintain health or resilience. And I guess in teaching masters and third-year students, I had to get my head around it, and there's about 12 properties with it. I won't go into them, but the big idea, the big story that really hit me in the face, and I think it's nearly as big as the concept of evolution, etc., certainly one of the big ideas of the last century, is this idea of self-organisation. That these, and I call them complex creative systems, not so much adaptive, they're living systems and very creative, is that if given the chance, and that's the proviso, you know, if you keep building a landscape, it's not giving it a chance. But if you step back and allow our farms and our earth and other systems to get on with the job that they've co-evolved for over millions of years, they will self-organise themselves back to better states of health or resilience. May not be where they came from. It usually never is because too many variables are in there. And that's what these farmers were actually doing intuitively, because I kept hearing so many of them say in their interviews to me, look, my job is just to get out of the way of Mother Nature, let her get on with it. And I kept thinking about this, what the hell were they saying? But then I realised, even without understanding how complex creative systems work, they intuitively knew that if they enabled the natural systems to work again, and by not interfering and belting their paddocks or their farms, nature would regenerate, and that's what's happened. We're now seeing extraordinary changes in all the landscape functions, and what I'm doing teaching students is sort of 5 basic functions for ecological literacy.
Now, you know, Alan Savory is a person who comes to mind here because I had the privilege of hearing him speak in Australia a couple of years ago and actually interviewing him, and he's one of my heroes to find, as a holistic dentist, to find holistic land management happening as well. It kind of, I think holistic is the way the world works, and he kind of challenges our notion about animals in agriculture being part of the problem, whereas in fact they're part of the solution. But you've come up with these 5 crucial functions or processes in these systems. Can you just outline to us what they are? Because I think people really, this starts to make sense to people.
Yeah, they're critical, and I'll just jump in first with a comment. It was really a wonderful holistic dentist, who I'm sure is one of your heroes, Western A. Price, who started to cotton on to how we were contravening a lot of the ancient health systems that you and I have just been talking about. Yeah, Alan Savory, a Zimbabwean ecologist, ran big game ranches and et cetera, brilliant naturalist. He, starting in the 60s, really pondered why the great mobs of African wild animals that used to migrate, you'd think, 1 million or more animals, they're going to pulverise the landscape and it's going to be in a bad shape. But actually what he found was that was the healthiest grasslands anywhere. And he pondered on this. And so those animals are huge mobs, they're dunging and they're urining and they're stirring up the ground. But because of the predators that are driving them, they're constantly on the move. And in a big migration in whether it's Serengeti or other parts of southern Africa, they'll move through and they mightn't be back for many months, if not 6 months. And being an ecologist, he put together the story that it's good for the plants, because once you eat a plant or part of a plant, the roots die under the ground and that feeds your soil bugs. But it's good for a plant, yes, to be grazed because they're adapted to it. But they need rest to recuperate and recover. And eventually he nutted out that what we were doing as humans managing landscapes, we were contravening that. We constantly grazed the plants. They never got a chance to recover, build up their energy reserves, et cetera, put down deeper roots. And so he came up with 4 basic biophysical functions. I mean, if you want to look at the cycles in a landscape, there's chemical cycles and weathering cycles and carbon dioxide. You could have about a dozen or 20. He simplified all that into 4, the solar energy cycle, which basically through solar panels and photosynthesis drives all the sugars that drives the entire Earth system.
By solar panels, you're talking about plants.
I'm talking about, I use metaphors in my teaching with solar panels on the plant leaves. But the photosynthetic cells, chloroplasts and stuff. So, but they're basically solar panels.
Yep.
And so that's what drives the system. And then you've got your water cycle. So if you get healthy plants and you've got deep roots and you've got lots of live bugs in the soil, your soil absorbs a lot more water and recycles it and so on and so on. And then the critical one to human health, of course. I mean, this is all critical, but there's your soil mineral cycle, so all those ingredients in the soil that are recycled because bugs eat other bugs and soil breaks down if it's healthy, and all that's recycled and put into the plants and the animals and so on. And the 4th one, you could summarise it as biodiversity or dynamic ecosystems, which is, if you have diverse ecosystems that are co-evolved over a long period, you've got all your pest control bugs and critters, and there's all these sort of corrective balancing systems that goes with diversity and complexity. And we farmers and humans generally have a great capacity to simplify systems and wonder why the wheels fall off with locust plagues and all the rest of it. But I guess I've added a 5th, and I teach all this to farmers and students. And the 5th I've added is what one farmer said to me, that 1 square foot of real estate between our ears. It's what we think. It's our worldviews, our paradigms we've grown up with. And I show photos to students of a fence line between one farmer regeneratively grazing or cropping or doing whatever, and the other side of the fence line, it's just beaten into the ground and degraded. And that's purely what goes on in the different minds of those two farmers. And the fence line is sort of a stark contrast. And so I call that the human social function. And because through my own mistake-ridden journey, I came to realise I was, if you like, I was landscape illiterate. I could not read a landscape because I didn't understand its functions. I didn't know if it was working properly, if it was healthy or unhealthy. And so really, I guess what I'm on about in my teaching, and that's a core part of this book, because the bulk of the chapters, through lots of great stories, describe these 5 functions. If we can get our landscape managers or our urban gardeners or whoever, or people making policy, etc., to understand how, and Australian landscape's quite different to others as well, we can understand how they actually work and function. And in other words, if we can become literate, we can start to read them. And then once we can start to read them, we can understand what we're doing to them or what we need to do, etc., etc. So it's sort of basic stuff, but it seems to work.
There's 2 things that in those 5 systems now. They're soil cycle, water cycle, soil mineral cycle, dynamic ecosystems, biodiversity, and the human social cycle. Now, the soil mineral one's so interesting because by putting the superphosphate, which is 3 minerals, what is that, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium?
Yeah, NPK, yep.
Yeah, NPK. I mean, the human body needs 60 to 70 minerals, elements, to function properly, not 3. And although a plant looks good with 3, a human looks much better with 60 or 70. And those 60 or 70 come from a healthy microbiome. Soil microbiome.
Absolutely right.
Yep.
And because it's got a lot of acid in it and it kills off the soil biology, you're shutting out the other 67 or whatever it is. But that's only half the picture. The secondary elements, nutrients, or what are called the phytochemicals, which come from plants photosynthesizing, there's tens of thousands of them, and a lot of them are absolutely fundamental to our immune system, to our health, talking about all those organs and parts of our body that essentially we are hardwired for all that long period we evolved in the savannas of Africa, etc., because we were eating both animals who were grazing these plants and ingesting these wide range of nutrients, and eating plants as well, and we became hardwired, and our immune and health system is hardwired to detect when these are lacking, and so signals go to the brain, whether the detectors are in our organs or our gut or our alimentary canal. And if you think about people eating a modern diet, bereft of a lot of these, either over-processed food, junk food, or industrial plants, which are basically, as you say, only got a few elements, their brain is constantly being told, listen, I'm missing this important manganese, or I'm missing this weirdo alpha something phytochemical that I used to get out of healthy meat. And so your brain's saying, look, I'm still hungry. I know obesity is a hugely complex issue, but there's an undoubted fact that a factor in overeating this empty crap food is the brain still saying, I'm still hungry. So you keep eating this empty crap. And big issue that you've just raised. Yeah.
And the other one, of course, about phytonutrients is in this time in our history where we are exposed to literally hundreds, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of chemicals, we need those phytonutrients to deal with some of those environmental toxins. But the other one you mentioned also is biodiversity. And I know that, whenever we talk about a healthy gut microbiome, the more biodiverse the microbiome is, the healthier the individual is.
Absolutely right. It's a pretty good rule of thumb, isn't it? And that's, again, that long phase of coevolution. Let me give you a quick example in a practical sense. When I took over in the mid-'70s as a pretty naive farmer who didn't know anything and made all the mistakes, I remember my father telling me, ever since the 20s when he came, we would regularly be wiped out by little wingless grasshopper plagues, not the plague locust, but a smaller variation. And they were so geared to eat green, they'd eat the green paint of a veranda post, and I think my mother's had a tablecloth on the line. They ate the green leaf pattern. But anyway, every 5 or 6 years, these damn things would come through and clean us out and drop us into sort of temporary or instant drought. And it was a result of a simplified ecosystem. We weren't creating diversity, and the soil wasn't covered up. It was bare for their eggs and stuff. So what then happened when I shifted my own management in the late 80s and early 90s is that within a few years, we haven't had a wingless grasshopper plague since. We've put in a lot of trees and shrubs. So you've got more birds and predatory insects. We've got moister, deeper soils, so the nematodes are eating the eggs and they can't lay the eggs, and so on and so on. So that just economically and production-wise, it's huge. And that's just a simple example of the need for diversity in an ecosystem.
In building resilience. Now, you also mentioned the human social cycle, and I'm going to ask you at the end, as we come to the end, to include our listener into this human social cycle, because it's not only the square foot of the farmers' brains that are affecting this cycle, it's the square foot of the consumers' brains. But I want to just come back to the issue of climate change, because we hear a lot about it. It's a big issue, of course. But this kind of regenerative agriculture, this kind of land management of animals is actually a big part of the solution, not the problem. Can you explain that to us?
Absolutely right. And I think I probably didn't follow on with one of your early questions about with agriculture and human civilization evolved in that ideal period called the Holocene. Where I am now at ANU, friends and people I know just down the corridor across the road at CSIRO, there are a lot of the leaders and the key commissions in the global climate change issue. And there's no doubt in the last, particularly since the Second World War, that we've moved out of the Holocene due to what humans are doing it. And as everyone knows, that's why it's now called the Anthropocene, a human-caused new geological era on Earth. Yes, climate change is a key player. We're putting up too much stored carbon, and stored carbon that came from plants, a couple 100 million years ago, whenever it was. But it's only one of 8 other major biogeophysical systems of Earth, that the self-organising planet where life created conditions for life. And so that planet does self-organise itself for health, like our ecosystems. And the carbon now that we've pumped up into the atmosphere and acceleratingly still doing it is a major factor, but so destabilisation of 8 of the other 9. The one that we've saved and which agriculture isn't involved in is the ozone layer, but we're now in the 6th greatest extinction event the Earth's ever seen, this one caused by we humans. The nitrogen and the phosphorus cycles, we're over-clearing land. And anyway, to come to your question, Australia's about the 3rd worst land-clearing nation on Earth after Brazil and Indonesia. If we stop clearing land now, we'd save 20% carbon going to the air immediately. But the other exciting thing about regenerative ag is not only can we address all those other issues I've spoken about, the nitrogen cycle. I mean, over 90% of nitrogen fertilisers comes from industrial fuel, and it does a lot of harm. But we can create improved biodiversity and all the rest of it. But we now know that through healthy regenerative farming, we can pull a lot of carbon out of the atmosphere. You know, you hear lots of arguments, we've got to stop this and stop the emissions and all that. There's not many concrete solutions up to now. There's some good books now talking about drawdown, etc. But we know we can fix a lot of carbon in the soil once you get healthy soil biology going. And you need your soil bugs to do that in a healthy soil. I won't go into the chemistry of it. And I'm talking about carbon that can last, you know, hundreds of thousands, millions of years, just like the fossil fuels that we pulled out of. So what I've been going around in my talks and to students and saying, yes, we're in the Anthropocene. Let's not lose hope. The solutions are there. And a key player that's damaged a lot of the systems in the Anthropocene is industrial agriculture, yes. But regenerative agriculture can undo that and pull in carbon and address a lot of the other issues. So it's really, my book's really a story about hope and solutions. And just to pick up a point you made early on, the title of the book, it came from one of these stories about biodiversity. I went out just quickly to visit.
Yeah, no, that was my next question, actually. You've read my mind.
Okay. He'd been one of Australia's senior economists who then bought a small farm not far out of Canberra, and he was working with regenerating his watercourse for using some of the work that Peter Andrews' natural sequence farming had done. So we went for a drive over a hill. Here's the neighbour's place. Merino Weathers running all year round. The place was pretty bare and flogged. The ground was hard. There was salt. No water in the creek because it all poured off too quickly. And then we went down the next valley, and here's this neighbour's place. A lot of green vegetation, which I hadn't seen on previously, the neighbour, spreading out from this creek, which was now gently trickling through a lot of reeds and vegetation. And this guy had only been doing this for 9 years. And as we were chatting and examining this transformation, there's a little patch of reeds, no bigger than a kitchen table, that some water bird must have brought in and had started to regenerate. And out of the middle of that came this beautiful call of this reed warbler. And I suddenly realised, look, that was probably the first time in 140 years since a reed warbler had been back in that valley. And to me, it became such a sort of metaphor or a symbol of how we can regenerate our landscape through, enabling self-organisation, etc.
Yeah, well, it's a great book, and it is a great book of hope, because setting it up, as you say, it can all seem rather overwhelming and depressing when we think about how big an issue or how pervasive industrial farming is. But it's a book of hope about regenerating, and not just agriculture, but regenerating the planet. And hey, I think that's in everybody's interest. It brings me to the final question here, Charles. If we're in the city and how can we participate in this regenerative agricultural movement? How can city dwellers get involved?
Look, that's a great question. I was going to raise it if you hadn't, because I've sort of coined a term for what these farmers are doing, because we're taking on the big end of town, the big food processors, the big multinationals, the big pharmaceutical companies, the Monsantos of this world that propagate this poisonous crap, etc., and then the big retailers. So I call these farmers and the urban people that are supporting them underground insurgents, playing on the underground of healthy soils. But it's not going to change from the top down. God forbid our politicians don't show leadership, and the vested interests of this madness of economic rationalism isn't going to change it. So we can regenerate our landscapes with healthier food, we regenerative farmers, but we need the partnership of the urban draw-through of demand. And not just that, urban people getting their head around healthy soils and food gardens, and Stephanie Alexander teaching in schools and growing local communities again. And so that's just as important as what we farmers are doing. And there's a wonderful movement now spreading, as you'd be more than aware. I've got my youngest daughter working in it in Melbourne, and it's very, very exciting. But it's got to be a two-way thing, this underground insurgency, and all power to the urban half of it.
Yeah, well, that's kind of the whole message of this podcast. And actually, it was when Alan Savory said that to me when I was interviewing him, and he said, if you're waiting for the change to come from above, you'll be waiting a long time. It's got to start from the ground up, and being part of a regenerative agricultural underground movement sounds like a very good place to start. Charles, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks very much for the opportunity. It's a great program that you promulgate. So great.
Now, a theme that I feel very strongly about is that the coming century should be the era of the revered farmer who grows nutrient-dense, low-chemical foods and nurtures the soil and land for future generations. Remember, a legacy, not a mess. I mean, last century, if that's anything to go by, I think was the era of the revered economist. And when we reflect on that, I think a lot of the current disillusionment with government is that everything seems to be about money and corporate influence. And we're encouraged to spend, we're encouraged to borrow, we're encouraged to be good consumers. We're all stressed, maintaining that kind of lifestyle. Striving to unstress and be well is another theme we're going to obviously be covering a lot of. And supporting this movement of regenerative agriculture seems like a win-win all round. Good for your health by building resilience, and building also resilience in the health of the planet. The two are inseparable. Now, Charles Massey's book is called The Call of the Warbler. We'll have links to that on our website. It's worth remembering that half of the food we produce in the Western world is thrown out. It's wasted. So, there is an issue there, which I've covered in some other podcasts as well. It's also worth remembering that 70% of the food grown globally is grown by local farmers. So the possibility for change is there. But like so much else, this change has to come from the ground up, from you and me, voting each and every day with our money to affect change. So, until next week, this is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Be well. This podcast provides general information and discussion about medicine, health and related subjects. The content is not intended and should not be construed as medical advice or as a substitute for care by a qualified medical practitioner. If you or any other person has a medical concern, he or she should consult with an appropriately qualified medical practitioner. Guests who speak in this